Welcome to the Cinematologist podcast. I'm Neale Fox, and joining me as ever is Dario Linares, though sadly not in real life this time, but it's still lovely to see you. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. It's great to see you as well. It feels like it's been a little while, although it really hasn't. But yeah, what have I been doing? Yeah, I'm generally good. There's parts of my life that are good, and there's other parts that, I'm still working on, let's say. Interesting to think about that in the context of work, because the stuff that I'm working on, that I'm really enjoying working on, is going well. The writing and the Substack stuff, it's been interesting because it's a platform that seems to suit me at the moment, in the sense that I can do a lot of writing, I can do the podcasting stuff, the audiovisual stuff, and there seems to be a community on there that are interested in a good faith interrogation of the work. So that's really great. I've seen a couple of movies. My back is feeling better. So all of that is good, but I'm still looking for some full-time work, for some paid work. So that is still a mission that is quite tricky, because the work environment is just especially egregious right now. I mean, definitely in sort of higher education. I mean, it's nearly the summer anyway, but everywhere people are saying people are just getting laid off left, right, and center, and the pool of people looking for work generally is just huge at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. I've started saying overall things are good, which I think's,
on aggregate.
Which is on aggregate, yeah, because I think that, it's a given that there's going to be challenges, but also, yeah, I found it a really useful way, even just as a kind of, even if it's a placebo to the self or whatever, it feels like actually it helps me concentrate on the things that are good and that are rewarding, rather than just thinking, oh my God, if I only think about these things that are not working or not great, I'll kind of get dragged into the funk of it. So yeah. I'm pleased to hear that, and the Substack stuff is really been really great to engage with.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one. I don't know how you find it in terms of being someone with something of a public profile, as we both are. That disassociation between coming on here or writing the Substack, putting stuff out in the public domain, and sort of how much the soul destroying stuff, or the stuff that you're really struggling with, enters into that space. There's almost, to me, there's almost a kind of onus to keep those completely separate. And I wrote a piece about this, the sort of struggle in my head of constructing yourself as a brand, which I really hate that phrasing, but now that's what the nomenclature is when people are advising you how to sort of grow your visibility and potentially monetize the stuff that you're doing. It's not enough that you just produce good work. It's got to be kind of constructed in a certain way that you become the thing that people are interested in. And I'm always fighting with that tension about, am I interesting enough for that? And do I want to actually reveal myself in that way? But then you get into the question of how much of this is all just performative,
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good thing to think about and talk about. I've been very fortunate the last few years not being on social media at a time where my career was kind of well established, reputation was well established, and was known for things that I was really sort of happy about being associated with, the podcast, the filmmaking stuff, like the film education stuff, and then the book coming out, like that felt like a really healthy relationship between stuff that crosses over into work, but is also my, for want of a better phrase, term, creative identity. But I think that, as you mentioned, in terms of like the kind of culture and atmosphere in higher education at the moment, I've had to think, well, I think, it's been incumbent on me to think recently about myself as a kind of figure in that landscape, because the precarity of everyone's jobs, including mine, it needs to be considered. So I need to think about, okay, well, what if I had to get another job somewhere else, which is not unlikely given everything? What would I do? What would I be? How would that look? How would I be able to communicate myself in that space? In a very, very competitive space with even fewer professors being appointed. So moving into that space what do I have to offer? What value do I have? And how do I then retain the kind of the spirit of the work that's got me into this position in the first place in an environment where there's very little call for, they're not interested in my podcasting. They're not even interested in my pedagogic research. What they're interested in, if I went for another job, would be how much money can I bring into the institution?
Yeah.
Which has never been how I've defined myself as a person at all. So there's definitely been a shift in my thinking in terms of, okay, I want to be able to move into those kinds of jobs if necessary, which for me is a big cognitive shift in terms of considering myself as someone who might be more aligned with kind of strategic positions than, someone who actually just makes stuff and does stuff, and that comes with a toll in terms of like, oh, actually maybe the next thing I do by necessity might move me into a position that I've never really wanted to be in. But what can I do? Because I've got a mortgage and 2 kids. So those are the things that they are at the forefront in a way that they haven't been for a while. And it does come down to that sense of self and identity, and what can I make peace with in terms of having to do stuff that I know probably is going to be really soul destroying and soul crushing for me if I have to do it.
Yeah. It's not easy, and I've taken that option that I have because I don't have the kids and the mortgage, but still, you still got to live.
For sure. For sure.
So it's not even a sort of question of being able to sort of say, oh yeah, no, now my life's absolutely great. In some ways it is, but it's like, there's another part of it where you're like, yeah, it's tricky. I don't want to, let's not go too far down this path and send everybody, packing in the first 6 minutes of this podcast, because I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And we decided we wanted to do one that was just me and you, and talk about a genre of films, a type of films that we've kind of been watching a little bit recently, which kind of was triggered really by me watching The Order, and then sort of recommending it to you and you liking it as well. And we just thought we really like heist movies, we really like crime movies, but also I think what's interesting about The Order, and then is that it pointed to a sort of sense of that hybridity between genre filmmaking and kind of social context. And, there's a lot of conversations about that right now, particularly around horror, I think, this sort of context of elevated horror, which a lot of people slag off, don't they? You know what I mean? It's like, why can't we just have the horror as horror? And I get that, but I like the elevated stuff. I like it when it tries to go into certain areas. And I think with The Order, it just is a reminder, particularly I think in terms of things like race and class, which is what we're going to inflect our conversation with today over the films that we're going to talk about, that there is that correlation, even though I've been doing some reading as research with some of the OGs of kind of genre theory, people like Steve Neale and Rick Altman, who wrote sort of big books in genre in the 70s and 80s about how it's this structuralist notion that only refers to itself and sets the conditions of its own meaning, and doesn't have this sort of correlation with real world understandings. But I think that's kind of now sort of been not debunked, because you don't debunk things in film studies, do you? But it's been challenged a lot. And we've picked 4 films that I think might help us get into that as a conversation.
Yeah. No, excited to do that. And just for us to be the ones that are kind of sort of going through that conversation. I mean, the elevated stuff I find interesting, because I think that particularly in regards to horror, it seems to be become a qualifier for people who don't want to associate themselves with liking horror movies.
Yeah.
And I think that if you look back at every period of kind of significant horror cinema, particularly, English language, all of those films would have been classed as elevated at the time because they were kind of dismissed. So it's a way of not dismissing horror at the time. Even Psycho, the Universal monster movies, British horror movies, like they have all stood outside of what is considered and I was reading something yesterday which made me think about this, about subtlety. Why is subtlety the benchmark for quality? That was it. Subtlety, so anything that's kind of slightly pronounced or gregarious, is
or even overt or ostentatious is ridiculed.
And genre puts those things up front, and everything else is on a subtextual level, which I think is why it's never had, which is where crime films are interesting, because I think that the relationship between the genre elements and the the social elements are often closer at the level of text because they drive the narrative so much of the time in terms of the reasons why those people are doing those things are often connected to social contexts, or at least in the kind of plot sense. And again, the films that we're going to talk about today all have that, I think, in really interesting ways where race and class and increasingly sort of capitalism in terms of some of the films that are more recent, and the more recent examples play a big role in terms of character dynamics and what drives those kinds of emotional arcs in the stories. Yeah. And I like it when that happens.
Yeah.
You know, I like it when there's a kind of, which is why it annoys me when filmmakers don't just own it and say, yeah, this has always been part of, you know, a gender, race, class element has always been part of the subtext of great horror movies, or great, you know, even comedies or musicals or whatever it is. You know, musicals probably less to a lesser extent. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that sort of came out of the bits and pieces of reading that I've done, is that this intersection of class and then probably race and gender as a substrata of that, or a strub node, or whatever, you know, pretentious word you want to use, but that sort of sense of how the films deal with who controls capital, I think, is really central. And then how that feeds into more complex and more sort of psychological questions of identity, and maybe more of a sort of sociocultural questions of identity, particularly in terms of what a character, how they're represented, but then how that character talks about and articulates what their particular grievance is.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's a really interesting point of inflection. I mean, just sort of to give the audience a clue in terms of how we're going to talk about that. So we'll talk about The Order a little bit first, as it's the film that sort of set us off on this direction. And then the two films that you picked were Odds Against Tomorrow, which is a Robert Wise film from '59. But I think it serves as a really good primer to thinking about how this kind of conversation goes back a long way, and probably goes back even earlier to sort of the earliest crime wave films. I mean, we're just talking off mic about The Public Enemy and James Cagney, and you know, if there was a film that sort of talks about that idea of capital as a sort of social structure, it's that one. And then I chose Collateral, the Michael Mann film, because I think it's again a really interesting aesthetic production of some of these questions. And then you're going to lead on a conversation about Widows, which again I think is a really nice way of leading off that, and then adding in the kind of gender question a little bit more.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, anything else to sort of flag up in a context sense before we kick off with this, Neale?
No, I think that's a pretty good overview of the thinking that we've had sort of going into it. I think the only thing is, which we did mention before, which is kind of worth, you know, this has been a really enjoyable set of films to spend time with.
Yeah.
And revisit, you know, from The Order, which was the first view, to these kinds of revisits of films and how they hold up and how they've kind of changed. And but just how pleasurable these films are, how they kind of are, which I think is something that we might even cover on the bonus, because we were both seeing Sinners this week. You know, where does the genre pleasure sit, and where does the other stuff sit? And in all of these films, there's a real engagement with genre filmmaking at whatever point of time they're being made, and the history of them, which I think are really interesting. Because I'm looking forward to talking about it. I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah, great.
As much as it's going to be interesting.
I guess the first sort of way into thinking about The Order is that question, which I think maybe underlies the whole of the podcast, the whole of the conversation, is where does the engagement of the genre aspect, where does that sit in relationship to how you then view the social political context? Because what was interesting for me was it was the sort of clinical high style thriller, the very much the production of the heist, which I think was owed a debt to Michael Mann and he, particularly in that central heist sequence, which seemed to be just cut so much in the same vein editorially to Michael Mann's sort of action sequences. But then again, even the counterposing of the white supremacist network and the police, whereas in Heat, for example, it was, you know, it's the criminal gang and the police are kind of set up in a mirror. That was done to a certain extent in The Order, but not so much. I didn't think there was very much a sort of sense of definitely showing the bureaucratic kind of context of that white supremacist network, what they were doing, what that was based off of. So there's very much, again, the social context was very much at the forefront of that, and that was fascinating to get into. But I don't think it would have worked necessarily if that's all it was. It had to be a really well visually and or hourly articulated crime movie that clipped along, that kept that the pace was up, that allowed the director then to kind of make those, layer in those commentary. And I think really, I mean, it was funny because I was reading some of the reviews, and sort of the term neo-noir came up. And I didn't think it was particularly neo-noir because I didn't think it was knowingly self-referential. Neo-noir to me is self-conscious in its use of homage. It's almost form over content. It's commenting on the form of noir more than anything else. And I thought that this was quite old-fashioned in a way. You know what I mean? It was like, I mean, I remember when I think I texted you and I said, this is something that reminds me of a film that's put together in a formal sense first.
Yeah.
You know, and because it was sort of a period piece, it's kind of set in the 80s and it's based on a real kind of gang in that sense. And I didn't think that it had that thing where, you know, you've got the two main characters, the Nicholas Hoult as the main protagonist on the bad side, you know, the white supremacist gang leader, and then a brilliant Jude Law. But I never felt it was kind of like the characterization was put on the top, and it didn't rely on the sort of overt charm of either of the groups like Heat does. You know, and then like they're both cool, like the cops and the bad guys. It has that sense of charisma, and you're watching these two sets of really impossibly brilliant and, you know, people that you almost sort of admire in an anti-hero kind of way going up against each other. The crew here isn't lovable. You hate them from the start, and they're sort of unified by this, you know, white nationalist extremism. And it does get into that cohesion, which is rooted not in the grounding of them being a like the work element. We want where the absolute crack team of thieves, you know, it's very much a sort of problematic sense of racial and cultural homogeneity, which is sort of at the heart of white supremacy. But the thing that it does is it presents that sort of sense of that being organized in an efficient and therefore kind of terrifying way, you know?
Yeah. And what I think is interesting about that last point is that within the film, there's a kind of spectrum of complexity within the white supremacist ideology. So, you know, one of the things that raises, it's not just like Nicholas Hoult as the white supremacist bad guy and Jude Law as the good, you know, FBI guy. Within the white supremacists, there's a tension between how do we build and maintain power, you know. So Nicholas Holt's a kind of guerrilla upstart within that organization, kind of taking it to very violent, very public displays of violence and ideology. And then the kind of the grand chief wizard figure wants a slower, more insidious, more political, like, we'll build this by becoming senators, congressmen, president. And we'll be able to establish this as a kind of, which is historically very accurate in terms of segregation, Jim Crow, things like that. But so within that, you have this really good dynamic for drama with so and then obviously on the other side, you've got Jude Law's grizzled old renegade FBI agent and the kind of the local young idealistic cop, you know, who's kind of, which is great. What I thought was really interesting is white, but kind of outside of this kind of white supremacist racist and that relationship. So it's all about character, which is what drives it. And then obviously the context of where these characters are, what they're doing is where a lot of that other stuff comes through.
You know, in every revolution, someone has to fire the first shot. Open the safe now! Now! Let's go!
Sheriff Laughlin, Terry Husk. I had a question about some flyers I keep seeing. White power.
Is that the Aryan Nation?
You know what my problem is with every fanatic?
You have to have somebody to blame for your life.
You know those pamphlets you saw? It's not all. This was in June. A bomb went off at a synagogue in Boise. That's just the beginning.
Beginning of what?
This book holds our birthright.
It tells the story of a group of white separatists waging a race war against the United States government.
We don't advocate any of our members breaking any laws.
But some do.
Well, you must understand that. Being in a cult like the federal government.
Why'd you call me about this case?
I need your help. Hate groups stole rob banks.
And yeah, I remember when we were putting this episode together, sort of like what we're going to watch. A film that it really reminded me of was The Friends of Eddie Coyle, which is a film I love. But again, in terms of it's just very matter of fact, very grubby, very much like, you know, it's not a glamorous thing on either side. It's just this is the lives of these people, you know, and the only one who really has any kind of sense of charisma or glamour is the kind of the high priest character. You know, but everyone else is just muddling through, you know, this is work and the moral divide is not necessarily murky, but like it doesn't feel like everyone's standing behind it from a kind of a very vocal, simplistic position of like of right and wrong, particularly in terms of how Jude Law's character goes about some of his investigating. But it's a good procedural as well. It's a good good film about how do you actually figure out this stuff, particularly like in a time before the internet and cell phones. And it's a good reminder of like the nature of investigative work and also how to organize from the other side. Yeah, it's really enjoyable, really well staged. I think the Man comparison in terms of like the staging of that stuff is apt. It's funny. You know, Jude Law's really good in this. Like,
he is
funny.
He is.
A sad sack character. Yeah. And yeah, it was just like one of those, I mean, because I interviewed Kurzel, didn't I, when he was in the London Film Festival for a bonus. I think it was for a bonus, can't remember.
It was. Yeah, that's right.
And I had no idea this film was even on the radar. And then it just sort of slipped out at the end of the year.
Yeah.
You saw it at the cinema, I think, didn't you? And then it popped up on Prime because it's an Amazon co-pro. And I was like, it was that infuriating thing of like, why is this film not more present?
No, it was weird to me because it was absolutely packed. I saw it on Boxing Day, and it was clearly people had gone out to see this movie. But it's not that. I mean, I don't know. I haven't looked up because I'm not interested in the box office of films very much, and it's something that people are, you know, obsessed by. But you know, just an anecdotal sense, it felt like a load of people had gone out to see a proper movie.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? On that particular day, and it's funny how that sort of Boxing Day period tends to be that for a lot of people. You know, they've done the whole Christmas thing. It's like, let's get out and do something adult again.
Yeah.
But I just think that the other thing, just to finish off on this before we move on, is the question of race here, because what's fascinating is there are no black characters. I think, and even though it's a film about racism, it's almost a deferred film about racism. And to me, it's much more about whiteness in the kind of Richard Dyer sense of the word. You know, he wrote that book, which is How Power Thrives Through Invisibility. And the whole of The Order is about this fantasy of purification, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
You know, and I think also that one of the counterposes between the two characters is they both, it's about the white body as well. And that as a site of battle, because there's that very, you know, that clear moment where, and this is a brilliant moment of cinema, which is not expositional in the obvious sense, where Jude Law takes his shirt off and you see the sort of bullet wound there. And it doesn't flash back to, you know, only a couple of lines of dialogue where he sort of, you know, alludes to some of the problems or some of the things that happened to him in previous jobs, you know what I mean? And how he's trying to sort of find a space where he can continue being an FBI agent, but almost kind of be in semi-retirement and stuff, but he can't be it alone, you know, and he's playing that sort of performance of the kids and the family are going to come and join him in this place, but they're really, you know, they're not going to do that. So yeah, and it's interesting from an audience perspective then, because I think, you know, the fear of being a little bit pretentious, there's a sort of Brechtian device going on here where the audience is lulled into the genre pleasure, but then gets alienated by the realization of what they're empathizing with. And it's not just that happens in a formal sense where it's great to watch the stuff. But then, you know, especially when Ty Sheridan gets shot, there's a kind of real sort of ethical reversal there, because that comes quite quickly after this moment where he's calling out the FBI for being kind of complicit and being not interested. And there's a sort of underlying sort of sense of that where Jude Law is the one that is interested in sort of pulling this apart, and he's kind of off on his own doing this. And there is that, again, it's not explicit, but that sort of inference where the state is not really that bothered about tackling white supremacist as an ideal, as an ideology. And that is obviously sort of still thought about today when we think about, you know, the wording of terrorist groups in the media. And it's like, there's definitely a terrorist group in media discourse is a very specific kind of thing. And white supremacy is, maybe until very recently, not couched in that kind of language. And even now with you know who in the White House, it's kind of going back the other way again.
Yeah. You know, it's a very subtle reminder that it's a white patriarchal organization, you know, so it's happy to just be kind of perpetually working through the process of investigating rather than actually doing it. And it's interesting, one of the films we talked about, maybe talking about, was Mississippi Burning. Sort of, and that's a big part of that in terms of like William Dafoe's character's response to the situation and how he's going to deal with it. We'll just bring a load more white people in. You know, and that's the thing, is like there is a reality which, and also that one of the things that's interesting about this film is that it is about race, but it's also about the complexities of race in terms of whiteness, because obviously a big part of it is not anti-black terrorism, it's anti-Semitism.
That's
and
right.
the Jewish community, and again, that's where it kind of ties very closely with whiteness and capital, and you know, and power, because it's a big part of it is that narrative of Jews and capitalism, and you know, and money and stuff like that. That's a big thing that drives the narrative. So you see that much more explicitly than you see sort of anti-black terrorism. And it's interesting that in terms of the places that they also attack in the film are kind of almost kind of very traditionally Christian places of what's the word? Not depravity, but you know, like I think it's like porn and stuff like that. You know, white people have been corrupted by the devil, kind of thing. Like there's a lot of interesting things that are not.
And the family as well as the family is a sort of breeding ground. You know what I mean? You can see at different points where the kids are being just, with that book especially, they're being taught in the ways of, this is how you and your kind of ethnicity has been disenfranchised by a complicit state. So it's and how generationally there's very little chance, which I think is nice in terms of, I say nice, but you know, I think it's a really kind of thoughtful way of making the 1980s context relevant to today, both in terms of anti-Semitism, but also this idea of we're here now because of those kinds of structural things within white supremacy that have indoctrinated the generation in the 80s and 90s to now through these really nefarious means like children's books and the family picnic. You know, all of these kinds of really interesting visual stuff. It's a really, and again, it's a really interesting film when you start to unpack it in terms of all of these things, which is why I think it's a really, really great genre movie, because at the time I was not consciously going, oh, this is about this, but I'm feeling I'm feeling all this richness, which is underneath just a really entertaining crime movie. And that still holds true, even though there's a lot going on. It was a really, really great movie. Cool. So why don't you give us some précis and some context on Odds Against Tomorrow, the Robert. I know you're a big Robert Wise fan as a director.
I kind of like Robert. I'm more of I'm a huge Robert Ryan fan, which is why I kind of that quite really.
He's kind of off the chain in this movie, isn't he? He's great.
He's kind of as he often was. And again, it's an interesting context to that in terms. So Odds Against Tomorrow is like Robert Wise film, and I do like Robert Wise as a director. And this was a film that he made in 1959 with Robert Ryan and Harry Belafonte. It's kind of produced by Harry Belafonte, who plays a sort of singer and musician who's in hock to loan sharks for a lot of money through gambling debts. And he's sort of brought into this supposedly easy job. And he's also, and the guy who sort of puts it together, who's an ex-cop, brings in Robert Ryan, who is really insecure about his masculinity and his age, which I think is an interesting part of it in terms of his place in society, which comes out. But he's also massively, massively racist. So the idea of having to do this job with Harry Belafonte's character, kind of he cannot move past his racism, which obviously is great narratively, and Harry Belafonte's kind of pride, and in having to do this job despite knowing that this person clearly hates him and is vocal about how much he hates him, and how and kind of worthless he thinks he is. But it's interesting because it is, sort of, there's a kind of star power element to it in terms of Belafonte wanted to make something where racism is at the level of text as well as subtext. In terms of the types of films he wanted to produce and star in this period of his career. And then Robert Ryan, I read The Lives of Robert Ryan, which was sort of a biography a few years ago, which is a really great book, but I just didn't know how active an activist Robert Ryan was. Like, really active, like in civil rights, particularly, but also in any kind of sort of, left-wing socialist cause. He was active and made it a kind of part of his career decisions to play these characters, to kind of get under the skin of, people who were kind of diametrically opposed to his politics, or, so you see in Crossfire, he's kind of a massively homophobic army lieutenant or general, something like that. Like Bad Day at Black Rock, post-war, brilliant movie, one of my favorite movies. He plays this sort of leader of this kind of white gang who have killed a Japanese American veteran and sort of covered it up. And then obviously in this, he's this really interesting character, but kind of, so you've got all of these kind of contexts at play where the actors themselves are really interested in this tension that sort of, but then you've also got a really, really great crime movie. Harry Belafonte sings and is this very, very kind of promiscuous sort of jazz singer, and they kind of have to pull this. They're sort of brought together to pull off this job in a small town. It's a small town bank, that kind of bank robbery. The kind of the week's takings for all the places in town the night before they kind of go out for payroll, I think it is. And it's just, it zips along. It's got there's a great Shelley Winters performance in it as well. I think it's Gloria Graham as well. So Shelley Winters is kind of like the sugar mama for Robert Ryan's character, which he hates, and I remember seeing this film when it was re-released by the BFI. I think Ashley Clark wrote about it. I think he put it in his Black Star season that he curated. That's where I first heard of it. And then it was got a re-release through the BFI. And it's just, I love this movie. I've seen it 4 or 5 times now. And I just, again, it's the pleasures of watching Robert Ryan, particularly who's one of my favorite actors. But also it's a really murky movie in the way that good crime movies are. But also I do find it interesting that there's such an open conversation about race, which I think, again, it works because Ryan is willing to go to really horrible places with it. Kind of unfiltered, because of, again, which I like, is that there was obviously a comfort in his own personal life where he was able to disassociate and be like, well, I know I'm this person and this is, I understand myself here, so I'll push as far as I can in the role. Because I think a lot of the time there is that kind of concern when playing outside, having to play a nasty character. Will I be seen as this? Will they think this is Robert Ryan, or will they think this is? And he's like, he doesn't engage with that. So you get this really, which makes it much more powerful and much more chilling, because you can see that it's what most people who would do the same thing but not speak about why they're making those decisions. He's very open about why he's making decisions. which kind of it makes it a really odd movie in terms of the 50s in American crime films, I think.
You're crazy.
All right, so I'm crazy.
You're counting your fingers and toes. I'm talking about 50000.
I'll take that drink.
What makes you so big you can call me up to this dump and shoot off your mouth?
I got an idea, that's why, Slater. How would you like to pick up $50,000, all in small bills, just for yourself?
Yeah. God, there's a lot there. I mean, this is the first time I'd seen it, and yeah, I mean, it was interesting to me immediately because I think there is a sort of progressive element to it, even though there is the right character is so horrible, because it's kind of playing with that idea of where does the racism come from.
Yeah,
and I think on the one hand, you could relate it to that. I think it's Freud who sort of talks about that idea of where does white racism against blacks come from in a psychological sense? Well, it essentially comes down to the fear that the black guy's going to screw your wife. To find a point on it. Do you know what I mean? But it's that sort of underlying fear, and that's what drives the hatred. But then that spins out into ownership more broadly. Yeah, and therefore it lends itself into capital. And I think that both the characters sort of do play allegorically as representations of the sort of systemic racism that then finds its characterization, in these particular men, right? And the tension between the two of them. So it's a sort of dramatization of kind of wider post-war divides, I think. Yeah. And also the sort of change that Robert Ryan's older and kind of tired and like beat down a little bit, his body's, and then you've got Belafonte, who's just this, incredible physical presence and, beautiful guy, and he's a womanizer as well. But then even that's problematized because he's got the wife character and the son who he's not taking care of, and that kind of question as well. And there is I don't know whether you sort of felt that, when you first watched it, but there is a sort of fatalism where you just know that because they hate each other so much, this is completely doomed from the start. And then it becomes a sort of question, I think, about what's the end point of kind of progressive, racial solidarity? Is that ever got an end point that can survive the sort of capitalist pressures that impart on working class characters, and then obviously on black working class people in a different way? So you've always got this clash of people fighting over the same bit of the pie. Yeah. And the one thing that white people have got is that they're white, to be able to kind of claim that little bit more of the pie than the black characters. Yeah. So, yeah, I think a little bit like The Order. Like you said, the layering of the questions about racial divides it never becomes didactic. It never becomes a kind of like getting on your soapbox about it. And I think that the main reason that happens is because you do believe you are interested in these characters. And, even though you're repulsed by them, they're watchable at the same time.
Yeah, because Robert Ryan is Robert Ryan, like he's so good. And there's a real vulnerability to it as well. I think the thing, what you're sort of talking about, the Freud element, and that's in there at the level of story as well, like with particularly with the Shelley Winters character. Like society has made this person feel like they're not a man in the kind of the archetypal sense, and he's got this woman who basically gives him an allowance and asks him to babysit for the neighbor's kid, and like he just was completely emasculated, and then he has to go and do this job with the Harry Belafonte, the film draws that link, I think, at the level of sort of character really, really clearly. But he's so watchable because you're completely magnetic, even when and this was always the case, I think, as well, that there's there's something roiling under the surface all the time with him. So even though he's kind of being outwardly vile, you can't help but wonder like what's made him like this, and you know what's driving it. And there's a kind of sadness there, which is a kind of sadness of masculinity in many ways, of how it's conditioned and how it's been handed down and passed down. And it's interesting in terms of like that idea of sort of racial harmony. World War II hangs over this as well, which again, like a lot of military spaces, is a space where a lot of that stuff is put to the side in service of fighting an even more egregious other and survival, basic day-to-day, hour-to-hour survival with the person fighting next to you. And even though I mean I know that obviously within the organization of the military, even in the in conflict, there are more complexities there, but it becomes crystallized into this moment that's all gone, you know. You know, and then you're back, and these are essentially two characters who are fighting over scraps. So all of those things, which we know in terms of like how you are conditioned to perceive people you're fighting against. Like Rob Ryan's character is arguably higher up the food chain, as a white man, but he's much, like you say, he's much older than Belafonte's character. So all of the access to potential is so interestingly done in terms of the casting. Yeah, it's a film I go back to a lot just to watch the performances and the dynamic between those two characters. But I also think that there's a lot of interesting context that's brought in from all sides. But I could also see why it probably wasn't very successful or popular at the time, because it's so nihilistic, like you say.
Yeah.
You just,
the end,
it doesn't matter.
It's like,
yeah. But you kind of, like you say, you know from the early stages, as soon as you meet these men, it's not going to go well. There's not even that point in a lot of crime films where you're like, oh, maybe. You're like, no, we're just waiting for this to absolutely explode. And the ending is just so downbeat. Yeah. Particularly, you know, where they bring race back in a really interesting way, right at the kind of the last line, which I won't give away. With when it's all gone to shit, there's a policeman says something, and the response is like, "This is what we're talking about." You know, that's very cryptic, I know, but it's well worth seeing. And when you watch it, you go, that's what he's talking about.
That's what he's talking about. Yeah, great. So it's an interesting segue to go from that to Collateral from 2004, which is what, 40, 50 years later?
50 years. 45?
45, 45. Because I think the casting of Collateral is really interesting as well, obviously. We could talk about that. But I was just thinking, I was looking at sort of Michael Mann's career, and just thinking about those sort of 5 movies in the middle, starting in 95, Heat, 99, The Insider, 2001, Ali, 2004, Collateral, 2006, Miami Vice, which I think are all stylistically, you know, and in terms of theme, sort of mining a lot of the same stuff with regards to things like labor, capital, masculinity, space. It's really, there's a lot to like in a lot of Mann's work. You know, there's only really, I don't know how you feel, but there's only really Black Hat I think I've watched and I thought that isn't very good. I know people do like it though.
I like Black Hat more
you
than
like
I thought
it?
I would. Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe a question for another, or discussion for another podcast perhaps at some point. But yeah, I mean, it's just something great about watching the Fox character pick up Cruise in the cab, and the terms of what this film is going to be set. And it's funny because it reminded me a little bit of the Mission Impossible thing, where, you know, there's a scene always where they explain what they're going to do and then they do it. You know what I mean? And there's something just kind of satisfying about that. I've talked about that before. But like with Cruise in the back of the car, and he says, "Look, here's $500. We're going to make 5 stops." And you just know that the terms of the movie are set, and that's great. And then just to see these two characters sort of moving through the different spaces, and how each particular hit has a kind of resonance for both of them in a different way. The city is sort of segmented into kind of ethnic enclaves in some ways. You've got the Latin clubs, the Korean businesses, Black community, and they traverse them, you know, over this one night. And the taxi is one, and they go from the airport into the taxi. So they're always in that kind of what's known, again, in terms of writing, sort of theoretical writing, as that interstitial space where, you know, they're always moving around the periphery and dropping into places where real life kind of happens, where they're always on the outside. you know, there's always sort of that sense that the city is navigated in a way that's very different to the way that we tend to see the world today. You know, that idea of tourism or cultural curiosity, but how it is navigated through different forms of violence, I think is really interesting. And the people in these spaces are just sort of casualties of the system that's been put in place. And the commodities of capital are not just money. There's information, there's service, there's labor, and then there's kind of forms of performance, which I think are really, really interesting. And also, I mean, it's obvious the dynamic between the two has a racial element which is more, goes beyond the two characters, where Cruz is this sort of representation of white capital as sociopath, you know what I mean? It's like the idea of, you know, he's completely self-contained in this suit where he could be a banker, he could be a trader, but he's kind of become the violent representation of all the violence that goes on in the corporate world in some way, shape or form. And then Fox is sort of this emasculated character, and he has this sort of dream of upward mobility, which he can never fully enact because he doesn't have the confidence to do it, and his sort of labor becomes weaponized. And it's just that amazing scene. It really is quite complex, where he ends up going into the sanctuary, the sort of club where Javier Bardem's character is, and he has to become Cruz, essentially, because Cruz doesn't want to give away his identity. And there's this whole thing about, which is so rife in toxic masculinity now, where, you know, and the manosphere, where it's kind of like you choose the man that you're going to be. If you're a simp, if you're somebody who can't be that protagonist, who can't take control of your own life and your own power, then it's your own fault. And it is quite, it's interesting because it's not a film, I don't think, that's seen in the same vein as, say, American Psycho or Fight Club, you know, where it text of pre-toxic masculinity as we see it today. So there's so much interesting stuff going on. And then similarly to The Order, there's just this ultimate pleasure of seeing the two actors kind of sparring off each other. It's just fantastic to watch that in action. And, you know, there's the Cruz giving it the whole, you know, I Ching flexibility, roll with the punches, you know what I mean? That kind of stuff is just great. And then Fox just does that great job of being that insecure sort of passive character, and then suddenly taking control towards the end of the movie, which again, I think, if you read it ideologically, there are problematic elements to it.
You know, if you just listened to me, we'd be all bogged down in traffic right now, and you would have made yourself an extra $5.
Yeah, well, you keep that $5, buy you something special.
Thanks, Max.
Hey, come on, I'll take it.
I got 5 stops to make.
What's your name?
Max.
Max. I'm Vincent.
I'll meet you in the alley behind the building.
Oh, no! What the hell? You killed him.
Red light, Max.
Hold on.
Man, you were gonna drive me around tonight and never be the wiser, but we're into plan B. Now we gotta make the best of it. Improvise, adapt to the environment. Whatever, man, we gotta roll with it.
You just met him once and you kill him like that?
But I should only kill people after I get to know them?
I'm not up for this.
What are you gonna do about it?
Yeah, loads of stuff there too. That was good. Yeah, it's interesting in terms of like the performances and the casting, because I think that, you know, I know that I went to a masterclass by the writer Stuart Beattie not long after the film came out, and sort of hearing about the script and how he wrote it. And I think it's a brilliantly constructed screenplay, you know.
Yeah.
And like you're sort of saying that the way that the opening unfurls and sort of sets the end in motion in really kind of dramatically resonant ways is so superbly done. And how a very, very simple narrative is complicated without feeling like everything's being contrived to get to the next thing. Like I think, and again, a lot of that level of character. But the casting's interesting because obviously the script was not written for a black actor.
No.
But it's what happens when you cast different types of ethnicities, different races, different genders, and how automatically you unlock subtext and you unlock context, and that just becomes part of the film. It can't not, and how we view those characters and that relationship, and what Jamie Foxx's character is kind of idealistic, but also maybe performative character. And I love that when Cruise calls him out and says, "You're never going to do this anyway."
Yeah.
You're just pretending that you've got these ideals and you're working. You kind of, which makes Jamie Foxx's character feel kind of really, empowered then to actually step out of this hiding place almost. But how he then has to give up and compromise all of this, all of what he's sort of presented as his morality in order to survive in that scene with Bardem's character is brilliantly done. And again, great performance.
And then there's just quickly, there's the little moral moments where you realize that Cruise does have, I mean, they're probably not representations or of his character that has some morality, but they're almost kind of like, these are things that you need to observe. Like when he goes to see the mother, he says, this woman brought you into the world, buy her some fucking flowers, And it's really weird little moments where he brings a morality that Fox doesn't, because he feels like obviously that the world has fucked him over, and he counts kind of like his family as part of that,
Yeah, which is what it makes him a great villain and an anti-hero kind of character, because there are always those moments where those characters say things or see the world in a certain way, and you're like, oh shit, I actually agree with that, or that's a really good point, or that's actually, he's right, don't be a dick, and then that complicates your relationship to those characters, because it's easy to see them as a sociopath, as a kind of gig economy gun for hire but that's not the whole story, and there's no flashback, there's no explanation, but there's that hint of something which just muddies it and makes it much more engaging. I think it's interesting in terms of like thinking of it in relation to something like Fight Club or American Psycho as examples from that period, but they are more ostensibly dramas first in terms of, whereas this is a genre movie.
It's a genre movie,
and all of that stuff again through Mann's preoccupations aesthetically and in terms of what he's interested in terms of male characters gets brought in. All of this stuff kind of gets brought in and added, and it just I remember I hadn't rewatched it for a long time. And for this episode, I was like, this is a really great movie.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Yeah.
It's brilliant. Like, it's so well made, so well scripted. Performances are superb. And then I completely forgot that Ruffalo's in it. He's so good in it,
Yeah. And it's that moment where Ruffalo was sort of, swarthy, young, Cuban he's sort of playing in this cop. But and there's that lovely little moment in the elevator where Cruise gets in and he says, "What floor?" And he says, Cruise sort of goes, "How's your night?" Meso, and it's just perfect, what I mean? And he gets off, and then it's just a love. I mean, and it's before Ruffalo kind of becomes Ruffalo the grandstander, in my view.
He has, it's the Marvel impact on Ruffalo, sadly, because at that period he's a brilliant actor. He's like in The Cut, You Can Count on Me, like there's he's amazing and stuff. Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to note on that is talking about the cities and the cars, because I think there's a real link in terms of this film and Widows. So much of Widows takes place in cars, and how you traverse the city and what you see when you're in that vehicle, and I think the vehicle itself is important because it's a symbol of American capital and ideology. The motor car, it's a very American symbol, and obviously the taxi complicates that. But it's still there, you're still aware of it, and how you move through a space in that enclosed environment, but then how then you have to sort of step out into the real world. I think is really interesting in both of those films, in terms of who's driving, who they're driving, and how, particularly in Widows, McQueen kind of shoots the car in interesting ways that kind of, almost a new way of viewing the motor car in the city, in an American city. But yeah, I think it's a really, I think it's a really, really great movie. And it was really interesting to see those sort of man preoccupations, and then read. It was a piece that was in the LA Review of Books recently about them, which talks a lot about this film, but also how Cruise is able to do that thing of being a star and just deliver the performance, which I think he's so great in genre movies, particularly where he's able to do that. And it was again just he's so nice to see him in this kind of movie, doing this kind of work. And yeah, just a note on the script as well, like all those things, sort of rewatching it, which are very, very obvious sort of signifiers of where the story's going, feel really, really, really kind of vital to making it work as a genre movie. And that idea which we've talked about before, like kind of the explanation of the thing and then seeing the thing. Like when you're making a genre movie, it's not about thinking the audience won't catch up, but it's about honoring the conventions and understanding that you need to keep the audience rooted, because some of the ways that the story is going to move and where it's going to go are a stretch.
Yeah.
And you have to have that sort of almost elastic band of like, back to this thing. And when it's rooted in character, which all these films so far have been, it's so much more rewarding because you go with the movie and you brought something which is about the structure of the story. And it doesn't feel like it's a message movie, even though it's very, very interesting about gig economy, capitalism, and who has the power within that system. And it's interesting because one of the great things about the scene where Fox has to become Cruise is that regardless what's happened, like Cruise's character has lost power. He has to regain power some way, and he uses a black man to do that. Yeah, but also he's not
as a shield against his own kind of like potential, downfall.
Yeah. But also infallible outside the system figure. He's still complicit. He still has to navigate its terms, and he's still at the mercy of someone else who's
that's a great point.
And I love that because it's, again, all of this stuff is just felt. It's a really it's really rich.
Yeah, I mean, just as a segue over to Widows, then I read this piece by Luis Garcia Maynard in Screening the Past, which is on Collateral, but I think it's really interesting because he talks about the sense of the crime film being quite anachronistic in terms of the way that identities or our conception of identities have changed from modernity to post-modernity. So, the crime film, there's a paradox of locating kind of the contemporary setting, and it's and the traditional attachments, I guess, to sort of ideology of heroism, right? Widows is kind of similar to this because there's a sort of impulse towards a new future of identity. So, the idea that the heroism of the working class man is kind of undermined in these films. But there's a sort of desire to keep that intact somehow in the crime film, because that's the ultimate hero. Yeah. And even in the anti-hero kind of works because you kind of feel for him in a way, and it's usually a him.
Yeah.
Whereas suddenly in Collateral, but even more so in Widows, that kind of thing is undermined, and you realize that the stability, the grounding of identity, and the hero figure and what that hero figure represents, in a genre film like the crime film, is kind of no longer the same as it once was. We've moved on from that.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good way of moving into Widows, because I think that Widows is very much about the past and changing for the future, or maintaining, and how much things have changed, so kind of the central political thrust of Widows, if people haven't seen it, is Brian Tyree Henry's character is a kind of gangster essentially, but he wants to run for alderman of a ward, and he's up against Colin Farrell's kind of incumbent, whose family have held that position for generations, and Robert Duvall's his dad, who's kind of stepped down and is ill and is just overtly massively racist, but there's about kind of maintaining this family identity, which is very much about the idea that these are working politicians, not career politicians, but people who have worked for their community, which is obviously complete bullshit when you look at it.
And it's all about power for him as well. I mean, he says, doesn't he, the Duvall character, it's like, it's about our survival in power. That's all that matters here.
all that matters. Yeah. And, you know, and again, narratively, this early on, which I only really picked up on the rewatch, was the way that the kind of the heist element is linked to the politics in terms of particularly the amount of money. So it sort of highlights where the heist is going to be very early on, which I didn't pick up on at the first time. And then I was like, oh, actually, well, you know, there's sort of, they mention this figure a couple of times, and then that's where it kind of
signaled a little bit, isn't it? You can pick it up.
Yeah. Again, because it needs to weave in the plot, in order to make it work. But essentially, so the story is that Liam Neeson plays a kind of a career thief who's kind of puts together this crew, and the job goes wrong at the start, and they steal from Brian Tyree Henry's character, who's kind of enforcer, is played by Daniel Kaluuya in an amazing performance.
Oh God, so chilling, that performance. It's weird that I forgot about it, actually, how good he is in this. You know,
so good in it. So they steal from them, and then in the process of the robbery, the police will catch them and kill them all and blow up the van with all the money in it. So Brian Tyree Henry's character, who's lost this money, which he needs in order to be part of his campaign to run for the alderman
against Colin Farrell.
Against Colin Farrell, yeah. So that race goes to Liam Neeson's widow, Viola Davis, and says, "You owe me this money. Your husband robbed from me. You owe me this money." You know, and so she goes to the other widows of the team and puts together this team to raise the money in 2 weeks. You know, very silly, contrived crime, but that's what we're here for.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
You know, and what I liked about the rewatch was like it's very much like it expects you to go along with the plot mechanic. Like, you know, if you're not gonna then you're kind of.
Me and B watched it together, and we were like, at certain points we were like, well, that just wouldn't happen. You would never do that. You know what I mean? But you kind of you are brought along.
And it's interesting that it's you know, Gillian Flynn is the co-screenwriter, because I think that one of the things I love about Gone Girl, the screenplay that she wrote with Fincher, is, you know, was it does the same thing. It's like, look where you are. This is what we're doing here. You know, it's very open about its conventions and very interested in just putting together a very solidly plotted thing. The other stuff it comes in interesting ways. But obviously the fact that obviously Viola Davis is black, married to a white man, Brian Tyree Henry's kind of, you know, this kind of, it just allows for so many different racial sort of intersections. And there's a great line where at the start, when he goes to her and they're talking, and he's basically saying, "You owe me this money," and she's like, "I don't owe you this money," and he's like, "You owe me this money," and he says to her at the end of this conversation about her privilege and, you know, all this stuff, he says to her just before he leaves, "Welcome back." Which I just thought was such a brilliant line. I was like, that is great, you know. So then obviously, so she puts this team together, which is the team of widows, or some of the widows, to pull off this job. And then, so it becomes about the planning of the job, but also you start to realize that this is not a simple case of going after some money.
You have no idea, do you? Or did you choose not to know? Your husband stole $2 million from me. This is about my life. This is about my life. And because it's about my life, it now becomes about yours.
Bad. Mr. Mulligan, your family's been involved in Harry's life for many years. I need help.
I don't see what I can do.
Our husbands aren't coming back. We're on our own. My husband left me the plans for his next job. All I need is a crew to pull it off.
Why should we trust you anyway?
Because I'm the only one standing between you and a bullet in your head.
So there's loads of story elements. I'm sure people have seen it, but I know that it was underseen, you know, and people sort of didn't really get a great release. And then, so I was watching it again, thinking how much to talk about where the plot goes. And I'm like, I don't want to assume that people have seen it. And it's such an enjoyable movie. Like, just I think people should watch it. The performances are absolutely superb, and it's a really grimy movie in terms of the subtext, even though it just looks absolutely stunning and slick and you're kind of gorgeous. The people are so grimy, and again, like Viola Davis's character is horrible. She's horrible to the women that she has to work with. She's very kind of, really interesting, egotistical, insecure, proud character, and how that kind of comes out in terms of having to pull off this job is really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead. No, finish off.
As a last note, it's amazing how the actual heist that you see is the last 10 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
It's all about the context of getting to that moment, which because it didn't feel like it the first time I watched it.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. There's loads there again that's interesting. I mean, the dynamic between the three women, I think, is really good in interesting ways, because you've got Elizabeth Debicki, who's like 6'2" or something, and plays this sort of, almost a sort of gangsters mall in training type character. I mean, she's married to one of the. I mean, she's the widow of oh God, what's his name? John Bernthal, is that? Yeah. So
I think so.
And you get at the beginning that she's kind of complicit in the fact that he's a bank robber, and he kind of beats the shit out of her. You don't see that, but it's implied that this is the life that she's going to have, and she's got this mother who's kind of like, suck it up, you know what I mean? And it's funny because she goes through the sort of metamorphosis, which is like, okay, how do I go from being useless to being useful? Which is kind of really interesting, and the terms of that, because she ends up using her looks to use this guy that she ends up with. And then you've got Michelle Rodriguez, who again is kind of like, she always plays, and she ended up in the action movies as the sort of tough female character in 2 or 3 action movies, I think. But she's kind of like playing slightly softer here, because she was sort of genuinely, genuinely in love, wasn't she? And there's a couple of really great sort of moments where that sort of dawns on her that her husband has gone, but he's a gambler, and she realizes she's in Beck for money for a different reason. But then you've got, I mean, it's like, what's really interesting as well is the sort of play of Colin Farrell and the father, and you get that moment with him where he's just kind of like, I never wanted this. I'm just the son of of this politician. I've become the politician, and the wife is like, you need to suck it up. Stop whining like a bitch, and go and win this election. You know what I mean? So it is that sort of thing where everybody is defined by their socio-cultural, their economic circumstance, their political circumstance, their racial circumstance. Whether that's black in the sort of sense of, like we've talked about, the cultural imposition of, that's the wrong word, but you know what I mean, the way that blackness in society is kind of defined. But then the other characters are all feel that themselves in their own way. And I think if you can kind of get on board with this idea of the widows sort of forming their own gang and deciding to do the heist themselves, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, which is fun, but again, sort of plays that sort of sense of the symbolic and what is being sort of talked about in terms of social capital and social hierarchy and race and stuff like that. And it's Steve McQueen as well. So, I mean, that's the thing about Steve McQueen. Some of that is more on the surface and more in your face than it is with other directors. Definitely Mann, who's more interested in the genre element, I think. Than McQueen is, who wants to get his kind of political points across.
Yeah, and I think that's, what I like about McQueen is, or at least I haven't seen the last one, which wasn't that well received, but he works with screenwriters. I think he's very aware of needing the kind of the story and the plot and the characters to be working at a very, very sophisticated level in order to be able to bring in the aesthetics and the, and I like that he works with a different writer each time to do that. So the films all feel different, but they all feel written in, I think, a really important way, very, very different ways across. But But I think as well, it's why Chicago works as the location, you know, because again, you're talking about the symbolic, but that's a city where all this stuff is
happening.
Still. It's happening, you know, so it works. It's a very quick way of being like, this makes sense that these are the lives that these people live. The Debicki character's really interesting. She has the really nice arc of the women, you know, like you see the way she moves, you know, which again is like, it just works really smartly rather than putting it at Viola Davis's character level, putting it a remove, you know. So again, it has such a nice layer, and she's really good in it. It's interesting, like that kind of the husbands and the Berntal character, because I remember thinking, oh, this is again McQueen being kind of cinephile. You know, you get this scene which feels like, you mentioned like James Cagney in Public Enemy. You know, I think of like Lee Marvin in The Big Heat. You know, these kind of really violent, controlling men, and the women that the mole character. That's what made me think of it. You know, like they're very well situated. It doesn't feel preachy because it's like, actually this is a staple of this genre, you know.
Sure.
And it's very knowing in that sense, which again allows the political point, but doesn't feel like it's, you know, sort of ham-fisted.
And there's a moment. I mean, Viola Davis is a great actor. Is an all-time actor. It should be recognized as such, because she's doing a lot of carrying here. I mean, you know, and it's not just because she gets, you know, she loses the husband, and then something happens and then she's got to organize the gang, and then something on later. If I'm not going to give it away because it's key to the film, but something happens later on, and you're just kind of like, oh my God, you've really been fucked over here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And she does that thing she's proper kind of, I don't know whether she would subscribe to method, but nobody does cry snot like Viola Davis. You know, it just literally comes out of her, all of her stuff. You know, it's great to watch that.
And it's how she can do that, but then also there's so many moments in the film where you just want her to say something.
Yeah.
And she doesn't, and she buries it, and you're like, you know, she's amazing. But it's interesting, you know, I was thinking about the casting of Liam Neeson. You know, I mean, the film's been out for a while now, but there is still that watching him now in terms of his career. In this film, this is, you know, and he's become this kind of crime action phone it in associated with this other stuff, and here he is playing the same character in this movie, and I think a lot of that feels very deliberate. And it's also interesting as well that, you know, the way that the story unfurls in terms of his relationship with Viola Davis and how difficult it was, you know, at the level of, you know, they have which is very early on, you realize that they've got a child together who's died, and then you see that in the film and how that is kind of socially and politically charged, racially charged. Like, again, a lot of it is it becomes possible through casting and through the character dynamics. And, you know, so when things happen later on in the story, you've got this really kind of strong contextual embedding where you roll with it because you know how it all kind of fits together on a kind of social level as well as a kind of plot level. It's very, very smartly done. And again, just like all of these films, it's very, very pleasurable to watch these actors go about it. And again, they're all original movies, as in, I know it's a remake of Widows, but it's not a franchise. These are, you know, that these are kind of original characters, even if they're based on previous characters or real life characters in the case of The Order and stuff. But in all cases, you're watching actors really enjoy acting and doing their job in a way that is kind of honoring their profession to varying degrees, you know, but also not at the expense of entertainment. It's not big grandstand, which is why, you know, Collateral, you know, I don't think he got any Oscars or, you know, nominations. Like, these performances are not seen as great all-time performances because they're in genre movies.
Yeah, that's right.
The genre movie, but you watch it and you're like, God, there's so much going on here. Like, and when Cynthia Erivo's character rocks up in Widows, she's amazing.
She's great. She's
absolutely amazing. And she's just like, and then, you know, they're so pleasurable. And the ending of Widows is particularly pleasurable in terms of how it all wraps up. But also there's a bit in the plot in terms of the heist, which kind of shifts the political ending of the film.
Yeah.
And you're just like, you know, I know this is something I think I felt in Sinners as well, which I know we're going to talk about on the bonus, but it's like the world is going to world, you know, and all of this stuff which happens, which one thing I really love about crime movies is it's a substrata of society where people are scrambling for survival and trying to make a living, make it work. But there's this other level on top, which is always going to be, it's always just going to be the thing. And none of this changes anything.
No,
you know, these people's lives, it doesn't change anything. The society, the structures, capitalism, racism, patriarchy, white supremacy, like that's a whole other level. And there's just this bit at the end of the film. You're just like, yeah, of course that's what happened.
Yeah.
You know, it finds a way to maintain itself in the face of everything that you've seen and think that should not be the way it goes. Yeah.
Great. No, that's been great. Really enjoyed that and enjoyed watching the movies. So fantastic. And yeah, always nice to do these longer conversations because sometimes it feels like a bit curtailed on when we're doing interviews and other stuff. But really nice to talk about those. And now we're going to go off to the bonus. So we're going to talk. We've both seen Sinners, and we both got things to say about that. And I'm going to talk a bit about Warfare, and you're going to talk about the John and Yoko doc.
I am.
Indeed. So please come over and join us there. Of course, it's over on the Patreon, and very reasonable amount to come and be a Patreon subscriber. You get access to all of our bonus content. Neale, I'll see you in a minute.
You will. Yeah, thanks for this. This was great. Everything I hoped it would be in terms of just us chatting about movies. Really enjoyed that, and hopefully our listeners did too. Thanks for sticking with us.
Indeed. So if you want to, please come over to the bonus and listen to us talk about those films. But on the main show, this has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.